A strict teacher humiliates a black boy in front of her entire class, tearing apart his painting and his confidence. But just as she thinks she's put him in his place, the boy calmly says something that leaves her frozen in shock. "My dad is your boss." Her world flips upside down when she's forced to mentor the very student she tried to destroy. But the deeper she looks into his life and his art, the more she's forced to confront her own bitter failures. What happens when the person you tried to break becomes the one to save you? Don't miss this gripping story of redemption, second chances, and life-changing lessons that will leave you in tears. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. The autumn breeze rustled through the maple trees outside Wellington Academy, scattering red and gold leaves across the manicured lawn. Ms. Laura Whitman stood at her classroom window, her fingers wrapped around a coffee mug that had long since lost its warmth. Below, students in crisp uniforms hurried across the courtyard, their expensive backpacks bouncing with each step. The morning sun cast long shadows across the pristine campus, highlighting the stark difference between the weathered brick buildings and the modern glass additions that spoke of generous donor contributions. The carefully tended flower beds, still blooming with the last roses of the season, added splashes of color that seemed almost defiant against the approaching winter. She took a sip of coffee and grimaced at the bitter, cold liquid. "Another year of entitled kids who think they're the next Picasso," she muttered, turning away from the window. Her desk was a mess of scattered papers and art supplies, a stark contrast to the neat rows of easels and pristine supply cabinets that lined the walls. Half-graded assignments from last semester still lurked beneath fresh syllabi, a reminder of tasks she'd been avoiding. A forgotten paintbrush lay crusted with dried paint, much like her own artistic dreams had dried up years ago. The bell rang, its sharp tone echoing through the hallways, and students began filing into the classroom. Laura watched them settle into their seats, her jaw tightening as she noticed their designer shoes and perfectly styled hair. Among them was Andre Coleman, who slipped quietly into a seat near the back. His uniform was immaculate, and his leather messenger bag looked brand new, though she noticed he handled it with extra care, as if it were precious. Unlike his peers who casually tossed their belongings aside, he placed each item on his desk with deliberate precision. "Welcome to Advanced Art," she announced, her voice sharp and clear, cutting through the morning chatter. "Today, we'll begin with critiques. In this class, only real talent matters. Not your name, not your background, just your ability to create genuine art. I expect nothing less than your absolute best work." Her words carried the weight of past disappointments, though none of her students could know how deeply personal this philosophy was to her. The students shifted uncomfortably in their seats as she explained the critique process, her words precise and cutting. When it was Andre's turn, he walked to the front of the room with careful steps, carrying a large canvas. His movements were deliberate, almost reverent, as if he were carrying something far more precious than paint and canvas. As he turned it to face the class, several students gasped, and even Laura felt her breath catch for a moment. The painting was stunning, a sprawling urban scene filled with vibrant colors and intricate details that seemed to pulse with life. Figures danced across building walls, their faces full of joy and sorrow, telling stories through every brushstroke. The technique was masterful, the composition complex, with layers of meaning woven through each carefully considered element. Warm oranges and deep purples created a sense of both sunset and sunrise, as if the scene existed in a magical moment between times. Each window in the painted buildings seemed to hold its own story, and shadows cast by street lamps held hints of hidden meanings. "This piece," Andre began softly, his fingers lightly touching the canvas's edge, "was inspired by my mother. She used to paint murals in our community before she passed away 2 years ago." His voice wavered slightly, but he stood tall, chin lifted with quiet dignity. The love and loss in his voice were unmistakable, raw and honest in a way that made several students look down at their desks. Laura felt her stomach twist into knots. The work was too good, far too sophisticated for a high school student. Her eyes narrowed as she studied the painting, searching for evidence to confirm her growing suspicions. Each perfect transition between colors, each confident stroke seemed to mock her own artistic struggles. The ghost of her own failed ambitions whispered bitter thoughts in her ear. "The technical skill here seems advanced for someone your age and experience level," she said coldly, crossing her arms. "Perhaps a bit too advanced. These techniques usually take years to master." Her fingers drummed against her arm, a nervous habit she'd never managed to break. Andre's shoulders tensed, but his voice remained steady, though quieter than before. "I've been painting since I was very young. My mother taught me. She believed in starting early." His hands clasped together, knuckles white with tension, but his face remained composed. "Did she now?" Laura's tone dripped with skepticism, each word sharp as a knife. "And I suppose she helped you with this piece as well?" The bitterness in her voice surprised even her, but she couldn't seem to stop herself. The room grew silent, heavy with tension. A few students exchanged worried glances, but no one spoke up. Andre's face remained calm, though his eyes betrayed his hurt as he carefully returned to his seat, his footsteps echoing in the uncomfortable silence. The painting seemed to watch them all, its figures dancing on, despite the heaviness in the air. As the other critiques continued, Laura couldn't take her eyes off Andre's painting. Each glance revealed new details that only fueled her suspicion, and though she wouldn't admit it, her envy. The layering of colors, the confident brushwork, the emotional depth, it all seemed impossible for a teenager to achieve alone. Yet something in the way the figures seemed to dance with both joy and grief spoke of a deeply personal vision. A mother's influence, perhaps, but there was something uniquely vulnerable in the execution that spoke of raw talent and genuine emotion. The bell finally rang, and students hurried to pack up their supplies, eager to escape the tense atmosphere. Laura stood at her desk, watching Andre gather his things with the same careful movements he'd shown with his painting, her mind racing with doubts and accusations she couldn't shake. The morning light streaming through the windows caught the dust motes in the air, making them dance like the figures in his painting, a parallel that only intensified her unease. She noticed how his hands trembled slightly as he packed away his supplies, and for a brief moment, her certainty wavered. The morning sun cast long shadows across Ms. Whitman's classroom as she arranged her materials for the day. Her mind kept circling back to Andre's painting, each remembered brushstroke feeding her doubts. She drummed her fingers on her desk, remembering her own struggles in art school, the rejections, the criticisms, the doors that seemed to close in her face one after another. The memory of her final thesis exhibition, where her work had been dismissed as derivative, still stung after all these years. The harsh words of her professors echoed in her head, mixing with her own voice of self-doubt. When the students filed in, their usual chatter dying down as they sensed the tension in the air, she waited until they settled before clearing her throat. The silence felt heavy, like a physical weight pressing down on the room. "Andre, please bring your painting up again. There are some things we need to discuss." Andre moved slowly to the front of the room, his painting held carefully in his hands, as if protecting something precious. The other students shifted uncomfortably in their seats, exchanging worried glances. A few whispered behind their hands, their eyes darting between Andre and Ms. Whitman like spectators at a tennis match. "Tell me, Andre." Ms. Whitman's voice cut through the silence, sharp as a knife's edge, her fingers gripping the edge of her desk until her knuckles turned white. "How exactly did you achieve this level of complexity? These techniques are far beyond what I'd expect from someone your age." "I studied my mom's work," Andre explained quietly, his finger tracing one of the intricate patterns with gentle reverence, his eyes softening at the memory. "See this spiral here? She used to hide them in all her murals. And these colors? They're the same ones she used in her last piece. She taught me everything I know." Ms. Whitman's lips twisted into a bitter smile, her eyes hardening with each word, jealousy and resentment bleeding into her tone. "Really? Or perhaps someone else helped you? Maybe even painted it for you?" "No, ma'am." Andre's voice remained steady, though his shoulders tensed slightly under her accusatory stare. "Every brush stroke is mine. This section here represents the garden she planted." "Enough." Ms. Whitman snatched the painting from his hands, her fingers digging into the canvas, leaving small indentations in their wake. I've heard enough of these elaborate stories. Without warning, she gripped the canvas and tore it straight down the middle. The ripping sound echoed through the silent classroom like a thunderclap, making several students flinch. "Work like this doesn't belong in my class." The students sat frozen, wide-eyed and speechless, some covering their mouths in shock, others shrinking back in their seats. Andre stared at the torn pieces of his painting, his hands trembling slightly as he bent to collect them from the floor. Without a word, he gathered the fragments and walked toward the door, his footsteps echoing in the stunned silence, each step measured and deliberate. At the threshold, he paused and turned back. His voice was quiet but clear, carrying a weight beyond his years. "I'll let my dad know about this." Ms. Whitman let out a harsh laugh, though a flicker of uncertainty crossed her face, a tiny crack in her confident facade. "Oh? And who might your father be?" "Dr. Malcolm Coleman," Andre replied evenly, standing a little straighter, dignity emanating from his bearing. "You've probably cashed one of his donation checks." A collective gasp rippled through the classroom, followed by urgent whispers that seemed to bounce off the walls. Ms. Whitman's face drained of color as the name registered. Dr. Coleman, the school's biggest benefactor and chairman of the Board of Trustees. Her hands began to shake as the full implications of her actions crashed over her, and the bitter taste of fear filled her mouth. The shrill ring of her phone startled Laura, nearly causing her to spill her steaming cup of evening tea. Her stomach dropped as she recognized the school's number flashing on the screen. Principal Matthews' voice on the other end sounded unusually stern, lacking its typical warmth. "Ms. Whitman, Dr. Malcolm Coleman has requested an urgent meeting with you tomorrow morning. He's quite concerned about an incident involving his son, Andre. This isn't something we can simply ignore." The principal's tone conveyed a sense of unease, hinting at the gravity of the situation. Laura's fingers tightened around the phone, her knuckles turning white. "I was simply maintaining the high standards of my classroom, following protocol as any diligent teacher would," she responded defensively. "This is a serious matter, Laura. Dr. Coleman is our biggest donor, and more importantly, what I'm hearing about today's events is deeply troubling. Some of the other students were quite upset by what transpired. I need you to be in the boardroom at 8 a.m. sharp, ready to address this." After hanging up the phone, Laura paced her living room, the click of her heels against the hardwood floor punctuating her anxious thoughts as she rehearsed explanations that sounded weaker and more inadequate with each passing minute. She'd heard the stories about Dr. Coleman's influential presence, how his philanthropic efforts had transformed struggling schools across the district, and how he commanded respect in every room he entered. Sleep proved impossible that night, as Laura tossed and turned, replaying the day's events in her mind and dreading the confrontation that awaited her. The next morning, Laura's hands trembled as she pushed open the heavy boardroom door. Dr. Coleman stood by the window, his tailored charcoal suit and composed demeanor radiating an aura of authority. Sunlight streamed in behind him, casting his silhouette in sharp relief. He turned to face her, his expression neutral but his eyes intense and searching. "Ms. Whitman," he gestured to a leather chair. "Please have a seat." Laura smoothed her skirt and sat down, crossing her ankles beneath the chair and fighting to keep her voice steady. "Dr. Coleman, I can explain what happened in my classroom." He raised his hand, silencing her with a simple, authoritative gesture. "My son came home yesterday holding the remnants of his painting, a work that celebrated the memory of his late mother." His calm tone carried more weight than any shout could have. "He told me everything, your accusations, your behavior, and your public humiliation of a student under your care. I find it difficult to understand how an art teacher could act in such a way. I have high standards for my students," Laura began defensively, her chin lifting slightly. "I needed to ensure—" "Ms. Whitman," Dr. Coleman interrupted, leaning forward slightly. "There's maintaining standards, and then there's destroying a student's work. One is professional, the other is unconscionable. I would think an art teacher would understand the profound difference between the two." Laura felt her face flush hot with a mixture of shame and anger, the heat creeping up her neck to her cheeks. "I could push for disciplinary action against you," he continued, his voice measured and deliberate. "However, I'm offering you a choice. You can either face those consequences, or you can commit to mentoring Andre properly. Weekly progress reports on my desk. Real guidance, real support. Show me you can be the teacher these students deserve. You want me to give him special treatment? Laura asked, her voice tight with resentment. No, I want you to give him the fair chance you denied him. Acknowledge his talent. Help him grow. Dr. Coleman's eyes softened slightly, revealing a glimpse of the concerned father beneath the businessman's exterior. His mother's art was everything to him. This isn't just about a classroom project. It's about respecting a child's grief and nurturing their passion. Laura sat in silence, feeling trapped between her pride and her career. Finally, she nodded stiffly. I'll mentor him. Good, I'll be watching his progress closely. Dr. Coleman stood, straightening his jacket as he signaled the end of the meeting. Don't make me regret this opportunity, Ms. Whitman. Walking to her car afterward, Laura's emotions churned between anger and humiliation. The morning sun felt too bright, too exposing. How dare they force her hand like this? But beneath her indignation, a tiny voice whispered an uncomfortable question. What if she had been wrong? What if she'd let her own past failures and insecurities cloud her judgment of a grieving student's heartfelt work? Laura arrived at school an hour early, her heels clicking against the empty hallway floor like a metronome counting down to confrontation. She arranged the art supplies with military precision, brushes lined up by size, papers stacked at perfect right angles, palettes positioned just so. Everything had to show who was in charge, had to reflect the control she desperately needed to maintain. This is still my classroom, she muttered, adjusting a row of pencils for the third time. Her hands trembled slightly as she smoothed her blazer, fighting the nervous energy that had been building since Principal Matthews mandated these sessions. At exactly 3:30 p.m., Andre appeared in the doorway, punctual as always. His expression was neutral as he clutched his worn leather sketchbook, the corners softened from years of use. Good afternoon, Ms. Whitman, he said quietly, taking a seat at the front table without waiting to be directed. Laura cleared her throat, squaring her shoulders. Let me make something clear, Andre. These sessions may be mandatory, but I expect absolute dedication. No excuses, no shortcuts. Her voice came out harder than intended, echoing in the empty room like an accusation. Andre simply nodded, opening his sketchbook with careful movements. Yes, ma'am. His calm acceptance only served to heighten her irritation. You'll complete 3 sketches today. I want to see your actual process, not just finished pieces. She watched him carefully, waiting for signs of protest or defiance, almost hoping for them. But Andre just started drawing, his pencil moving with practiced confidence across the page, each stroke deliberate and sure. Laura hovered nearby, searching for flaws to correct, her shadow falling across his work. His lines were clean and purposeful. The shading showed depth that frustrated her attempts to criticize. Your perspective is slightly off, she said sharply, though it wasn't true. Andre made a small adjustment without comment and continued working, his focus unwavering. The minutes ticked by in tense silence, marked only by the soft scratch of pencil on paper. Laura grew increasingly agitated by Andre's calm focus, pacing between the tables. Her usual tactics for asserting authority seemed to bounce off him harmlessly, like rain against a window. When the session ended, Andre gathered his supplies quietly, tucking his pencils away with care. Thank you for your time, he said, heading for the door with the same steady composure he'd shown throughout. Laura noticed the leather sketchbook still sitting on the table, forgotten in his departure. Wait, you forgot. But Andre was already gone, his footsteps fading down the hall. She stared at the book, telling herself she shouldn't look, that it would be unprofessional. But curiosity won out. She opened it carefully, as if it might crumble in her hands. The pages were filled with stunning drawings, portraits of people with eyes that seemed alive, cityscapes that captured both grit and beauty, and scenes that told stories without words. But what caught her breath were the sketches of a woman with Andre's same gentle eyes, shown painting murals surrounded by smiling children. Each drawing was infused with warmth and memory, The love and loss in those drawings was palpable, reaching out from the pages to touch something long buried in her own heart. Laura sank into her chair, her certainty crumbling as she traced the careful lines with trembling fingers, suddenly aware of the weight of her own assumptions. Laura sat in her darkened living room, the only light coming from a small lamp beside her worn armchair. The shadows danced across the walls, matching her conflicted mood. Andre's sketchbook lay on the coffee table like a silent accusation. She'd brought it home, telling herself she needed to evaluate his skill level, but guilt gnawed at her conscience, making her second-guess every decision. "This is ridiculous," she muttered, reaching for her wine glass with trembling fingers. "I'm his teacher. I have every right to review his work." The words felt hollow, even as she spoke them into the empty room. Her fingers traced the worn leather cover before slowly opening it. The first page took her breath away. A detailed portrait of a woman painting a vibrant mural, her face lit with joy. Andre's mother. The skill was undeniable, but it was the emotion that struck Laura hardest. Every pencil stroke seemed to pulse with love and loss, telling a story that words couldn't capture. Page after page revealed Andre's inner world. There were sketches of empty chairs at dinner tables, half-finished conversations frozen in time, and abstract swirls of darkness pierced by rays of light. One drawing showed small hands reaching for paintbrushes that were just out of reach. Each piece was like a window into his soul, raw and honest in a way that made her chest ache. "He's processing his grief through art," Laura whispered, her throat tight with unexpected emotion. She ran her fingertips over the lines, feeling the indentations in the paper where he'd pressed harder, as if trying to make the memories permanent. The images stirred memories she'd tried to bury. She remembered standing before her own mentor, Professor Richards, trembling as he tore into her work. "Mediocre at best," he'd sneered, his face twisted with contempt. "Perhaps accounting would better suit your talents." Those words had haunted her for years, slowly poisoning her passion for art, until it withered like a flower without sunlight. Laura's hands clenched around the sketchbook, her knuckles white with tension. "But it's different for him," she said bitterly, her voice breaking the silence. "He has everything I didn't. A father who can buy his way into any opportunity, the best materials, the finest education." The wine in her glass rippled with her shaking hands. Yet even as the words left her mouth, she knew they rang hollow. The raw talent in these pages couldn't be bought. The emotion couldn't be faked. Each drawing spoke of countless hours of practice, of dedication born from love rather than privilege. The truth of it made her stomach twist with shame. She placed the sketchbook back on the coffee table, suddenly unable to look at it anymore. The leather cover seemed to mock her, reflecting back all her failures and bitter choices. Tomorrow she would return it to Andre during their session. But for now, she sat in the dim light, wrestling with the uncomfortable realization that perhaps she'd been wrong about him, and trying to silence the voice that whispered she'd become exactly what she'd once feared most. Another Professor Richards crushing young dreams with cruel words. The morning sun streamed through the classroom windows as Laura arranged her materials with shaking hands. Andre's sketchbook felt heavy in her grip, a reminder of her late-night exploration of his personal artwork. The weight of what she'd discovered in those pages, the raw talent, the emotional depth, made her fingers tremble slightly as she positioned it on her desk. She checked the clock repeatedly, her stomach tight with an unfamiliar anxiety that made her throat feel dry. Andre entered right on time, his footsteps quiet on the linoleum floor. He carried his usual supplies, a worn backpack and a plastic bag containing his art materials, his face neutral as he gave her a small nod. The morning light caught the dark circles under his eyes, suggesting another late night of creating. "You left this yesterday," Laura said, holding out the sketchbook. Her voice came out more strained than she'd intended, catching slightly on the words. "Thank you, Ms. Whitman." Andre took it carefully, tucking it into his bag without checking its contents. His gentle handling of the book spoke volumes about its importance to him. As they settled into their workstations, Laura cleared her throat. The sound seemed too loud in the quiet room. "Before we begin, I'd like to hear more about what inspires your work." Andre looked up, surprise flickering across his face. He stayed quiet for a moment, his fingers tracing the edge of his desk in slow, thoughtful circles. "My mom," he finally said softly. "She was an artist too." "Tell me about her work," Laura prompted, trying to keep her tone professional despite the curiosity gnawing at her. "She painted murals all over the city." Andre's voice grew stronger, his eyes brightening with pride and memory. "She believed art could bring people together. Every mural told a story about hope and community." He paused, swallowing hard, his hand unconsciously moving to touch the front of his shirt where a small paint stain marked the fabric. "After she passed, I felt lost, but when I started painting, it was like having a piece of her back." Laura's chest tightened as she watched him speak. His words carried such genuine emotion, such clear purpose, making her own artistic journey seem shallow in comparison. She thought of her own scattered attempts at art, driven by desperate need for recognition rather than any deeper meaning. The contrast stung like a fresh paper cut. That's very touching," she managed, her jealousy rising like bile in her throat. Here was this boy, barely 16, with more artistic direction than she'd ever had. The unfairness of it made her want to scream. "But perhaps we should focus on technical skills next time. That's enough for today." Andre gathered his things without protest, but Laura caught the hint of disappointment in his expression. His shoulders slumped slightly as he packed up his supplies with careful, practiced movements. As he walked toward the door, Laura turned to her desk, muttering under her breath, "It's not fair." She shuffled papers aimlessly, refusing to watch him leave, the sound of his footsteps fading into the hallway like an accusation. The art room buzzed with nervous energy as Ms. Whitman paced between the students' workstations. "Today's project is about pushing boundaries," she announced, her voice sharp and demanding. "I expect to see work that challenges conventional thinking." Andre sat quietly at his easel, already absorbed in his work. His brush moved with confident strokes across the canvas, bringing to life a scene that seamlessly blended urban landscapes with flowing natural elements. His hands moved as if guided by an invisible force, each stroke purposeful and deliberate. Ms. Whitman lingered behind him, her shadow falling across his work like a looming critique. "Mr. Coleman," she said loudly enough for the whole class to hear, "this seems rather derivative, don't you think?" Andre's hand paused mid-stroke. "I'm exploring the connection between city life and nature," he explained softly, his voice barely above a whisper, "like my mother used to do." "Ah yes, your mother again." Ms. Whitman's voice dripped with sarcasm and impatience. "Perhaps it's time to find your own voice instead of copying someone else's style." The classroom grew uncomfortably quiet. Students pretended to focus on their work, but their stiff postures betrayed their attention to the exchange. The tension in the room was palpable. "The technique here is sloppy," she continued, pointing at perfectly executed details with a dismissive gesture. "And this composition is far too predictable. I expected more originality from you." Andre nodded thoughtfully, considering her words. "Thank you for the feedback," he said simply, before returning to his work with the same steady focus. His calm, measured response seemed to irritate Ms. Whitman even more. She opened her mouth to deliver another criticism but stopped when she noticed several students watching her with disapproving expressions. Their silent solidarity spoke volumes, and for a moment, Ms. Whitman hesitated. After class, as Andre packed up his supplies, Marisol approached his desk. She glanced nervously at Ms. Whitman before leaning close to Andre. "I don't know why she's so hard on you," she whispered. "Your work is amazing." Andre's lips curved into a small smile, gratitude shining in his eyes, but he remained silent, carefully wrapping his brushes in their cloth case. The gesture was one of quiet resilience. Later that evening, Ms. Whitman stood in her home studio, staring at an empty canvas. The white surface seemed to mock her, challenging her to create something meaningful. She picked up a brush, then set it down again. Picked it up, set it down. Her thoughts kept drifting to Andre's painting, to the ease with which he translated his vision onto canvas. She grabbed a tube of paint, squeezing it too hard onto her palette. The dark blue pigment oozed out in a messy glob. Her hand shook as she tried to mix colors, but nothing looked right. Nothing felt right. The blank canvas loomed before her, pristine and accusatory. She couldn't shake the image of Andre's steady hand, his quiet confidence, the way other students looked at his work with admiration, the same admiration she'd once dreamed of receiving. Ms. Whitman dropped her brush, letting it clatter onto the palette. She slumped onto her stool, the empty canvas a testament to her creative paralysis. The weight of her own expectations and the realization of her fading inspiration pressed down on her shoulders, leaving her feeling more lost than ever. The harsh overhead light cast long shadows across Laura's studio as she sat surrounded by half-finished canvases. The room felt smaller tonight, cluttered with years of abandoned projects and broken dreams. Her hand trembled slightly as she reached for a brush, then pulled back. The blank canvas before her seemed to mock her inability to create, its pristine white surface an accusation of her failure. "Just paint something," she whispered to herself, but the words felt hollow, echoing in the empty studio. Her gaze drifted to a painting she'd started years ago, vibrant colors now dulled by dust, the passion behind it long forgotten. She remembered how alive she'd felt while working on it, before doubt had crept in and stolen her confidence. Andre's quiet confidence in class today had stirred something in her. The way he approached his work, unhurried and sure, reminded her of herself before that day when her mentor had torn apart her graduate exhibition piece. The memory of that critique still stung like a fresh wound. "Your work lacks depth," the memory echoed. "Perhaps you should consider teaching instead." The words had shaped her life ever since, becoming a self-fulfilling prophecy she couldn't escape. Laura pulled Andre's sketchbook from her bag, telling herself she needed to review it for tomorrow's session. Her fingers lingered on the worn cover before opening it. Each page turn was meant to find fault, to justify her treatment of him. Instead, she found herself drawn into the story each sketch told, feeling the emotion behind every line. There was one of his mother painting a mural, her brush extended high, joy evident in every pencil stroke. The woman's face radiated love for her work and the community she served. Another showed a community garden where flowers seemed to dance off the page, each petal captured with delicate precision and care. Without realizing it, Laura's hand had found a pencil. In the margins of her own notebook, small sketches began to form, tentative at first, then with growing confidence. The familiar movement felt like remembering an old song, the melody returning note by note. Her breathing slowed as she lost herself in the simple act of creation. "This doesn't mean anything," she muttered, but her hand kept moving. Shapes emerged, colors blended. For the first time in years, she felt that familiar spark, the one she thought had died long ago. It flickered weakly, but it was there, warming her from within. Laura straightened up, suddenly aware she'd been drawing for over an hour. The studio had grown darker, but she barely noticed. She looked at her sketch, then back at Andre's work. "I can help shape his talent," she said aloud, her voice firm. "If I can't succeed, at least I can shape someone who might." But even as she said the words, something felt different. The bitterness that usually accompanied thoughts of teaching art had softened, replaced by something she wasn't ready to name. Maybe, just maybe, there was still a chance for both of them to grow. The late afternoon sun cast long, warm shadows through the art room windows as Andre hunched over his work, his pencil moving with unwavering purpose across the large sheet of paper. Ms. Whitman paused in the doorway, her eyes drawn to the focused intensity of his movements. His dedication was evident in every careful line, every thoughtful pause to consider his next stroke. She'd noticed his pattern over the past week, staying well after the final bell, often until the janitor's cart squeaked past in the hallway. While his classmates rushed home, eager to start their evenings, Andre remained, completely absorbed in the creative process of designing his mural. Laura's hand tightened slightly around her coffee mug as she observed his technique. His confidence with perspective and composition was undeniable, though she tried to ignore the twinge of admiration it stirred within her. A part of her couldn't help but be impressed by his natural talent. Finally, she cleared her throat and stepped into the room. Andre looked up, startled but composed, his dark eyes meeting hers with a quiet curiosity. "Your shading technique needs a bit of work," she said. her voice lacking its usual edge of criticism. She set her mug down and moved closer to his desk. "See here? If you adjust the pressure of your strokes, you can create more depth and dimension." Andre blinked in surprise at her constructive tone. "Like this?" he asked, demonstrating on a corner of his paper. "Better," she nodded, a hint of a smile tugging at the corners of her lips. "But try varying the angle slightly." She grabbed a spare pencil and showed him on another sheet, their hands briefly brushing as they collaborated. As they worked side by side, Andre began explaining his vision for the mural, his words brimming with passion. "I wanted to show how art connects people," he said, pointing to different elements in his design. "My mom always said that murals belong to everyone who sees them. They tell stories that bring communities together." Laura found herself nodding, remembering her own fervent declarations about art's purpose when she was his age, before life had worn down her idealism. "The composition is interesting," she admitted reluctantly. "The way you've linked these figures together creates a strong sense of movement and unity." They continued discussing techniques and ideas, the usual tension between them temporarily forgotten. Andre's enthusiasm was infectious, reminding Laura of long-ago nights spent sketching until dawn, lost in the pure joy of creation. When Andre finally packed up his supplies, the sky outside had turned a deep, vibrant purple with the approaching dusk. After he left, Laura remained at her desk, staring at the blank sketchbook page before her. With slightly trembling fingers, she picked up a pencil and began to draw, letting the quiet of the empty classroom wrap around her like a familiar, comforting blanket. The soft scratching of her pencil filled the silence as she worked, rediscovering a part of herself she thought she had lost long ago. Ms. Whitman shifted uncomfortably in her chair as the faculty meeting droned on in the cramped conference room. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead while Principal Martinez led the discussion about student achievements. The smell of stale coffee lingered in the air, mixing with the faint scent of whiteboard markers. "And speaking of exceptional students," Mrs. Chen, the English teacher, chimed in, her face brightening. "Andre Coleman's work in my class has been outstanding. His essays show such depth of emotion. He has a way of making readers truly feel what he's describing." Other teachers nodded in agreement, several leaning forward with interest. Mr. Peters, the history teacher, added, "He's incredibly focused, always going above and beyond. Just last week, he connected our civil rights unit to modern community activism in such a thoughtful way." Laura's chest tightened. She stared down at her notepad, drawing small circles in the margin as the praise continued, pressing harder with each loop until the ink bled through the paper. Part of her wanted to smile, to claim some credit for Andre's success, but another part, the part still haunted by her own failed dreams, made her grip her pen harder until her knuckles turned white. "The mural project is generating quite a buzz," Principal Martinez said, gesturing enthusiastically. "It'll be wonderful to have such a talented student showcase our arts program. I've already heard positive feedback from the school board." "Ms. Whitman," Mrs. Chen turned to her, eyes bright with interest, leaning across the table. "You must be thrilled to mentor someone like Andre. How's that going? Have you seen his portfolio?" The room fell silent. Laura felt all eyes on her, waiting. The weight of their expectant gazes made her collar feel too tight. She cleared her throat. "I'm just providing basic guidance," she said, her voice tight. "Andre already has a strong foundation. I'm merely helping him stay on track." "Well, whatever you're doing, it's working." Principal Martinez smiled warmly. "We're lucky to have both of you. Your experience is clearly making a difference." Laura nodded stiffly, relief washing over her as the conversation moved to other topics. But the pride in their voices when discussing Andre lingered in her mind, stirring up memories of her own critiques in art school. The harsh words, the dismissive looks, the way her professor had torn her work apart in front of the entire class. When she returned to the art room later, Andre was there, bent over his design. The afternoon light streamed through the dusty windows, caught the detailed lines of his work, highlighting the careful thought behind each element. His pencil moved with confident strokes across the paper. Laura studied the mural design, noting how he'd incorporated subtle symbols of community and growth throughout the piece, weaving them together in a way that seemed effortless. "This is—" She paused, surprising herself with the warmth in her voice, fighting against her usual instinct to find fault. "Really good work, Andre." He looked up, momentarily startled by the genuine praise, his pencil pausing mid-stroke. A small smile crossed his face, reaching his eyes. "Thank you, Ms. Whitman," he said quietly, the sincerity in his voice unmistakable. The words hung between them, marking a subtle but undeniable change in their relationship. For a moment, the afternoon sun seemed to glow a little brighter through the windows. Andre stood in front of Ms. Whitman's desk, his eyes bright with excitement. "I want to enter the Young Artists Vision Competition," he said, holding out a thick application packet. "Would you look at my final design?" Laura's stomach tightened. She knew this competition well. She'd entered it herself 20 years ago and hadn't even made it past the first round. The memory still stung, a bitter reminder of her own unfulfilled dreams. "The deadline's next week," Andre continued, spreading his mural design across her desk. The vibrant colors and intricate details showed how much he'd grown over the past months. His talent was undeniable, shining through every line and hue. "I've been working on it every night," he explained, pointing to new elements he'd added. "See how I incorporated the community stories here? Like my mom used to do?" His voice held a mix of pride and nostalgia. Laura studied the design, fighting the jealousy that threatened to surface. The work was exceptional, better than anything she'd produced at his age. Her hands trembled slightly as she traced the lines with her finger, feeling the raw talent that poured into each stroke. "The composition here could be stronger," she found herself saying, gesturing to one corner. "If you adjust these figures." She grabbed a pencil and demonstrated the change, her own artistic instincts kicking in despite her initial reluctance. Andre nodded eagerly, taking notes. They spent the next hour working side by side, Laura pointing out areas for improvement while Andre made careful adjustments. To her surprise, she found herself genuinely invested in helping him succeed, her heart warming to the idea of nurturing his gift rather than envying it. "What about the lighting in this section?" she suggested, leaning closer to the design. "If you enhanced the contrast here, it would make the central message more powerful." "That's perfect," Andre said, his face lighting up as he implemented her suggestion. "I never would have thought of that. Thank you, Ms. Whitman." As they worked, Laura felt something shift inside her. For the first time, she wasn't seeing Andre as a threat to her own unfulfilled dreams, but as a student she could truly help. The weight of her past failures seemed to lift, replaced by a sense of purpose and connection. "Thank you, Ms. Whitman," Andre said as he carefully rolled up his revised design. "Your feedback has helped me so much. I mean it." The sincerity in his voice made her throat tight with guilt as she remembered how cruelly she'd treated him at the beginning of the semester. His gratitude was a stark contrast to her initial harshness, and it stirred something deep within her. That evening, Laura sat in her home studio, staring at a blank canvas. Andre's determination and passion had awakened something in her. She picked up a brush, and for the first time in years, began to paint without hesitation or fear. The colors flowed freely, and with each stroke she felt a piece of herself coming back to life. 2 weeks later, Andre burst into the art room, his face glowing with excitement. His backpack swung wildly as he rushed through the door. "I made it! I'm a finalist!" he announced, holding up his phone to show the confirmation email, his hands trembling slightly with joy. The class erupted in cheers. Several students rushed to pat him on the back, while others gathered around to read the email, their excited voices filling the room with a buzz of celebration. Some called out, "Way to go," and "You deserve it." Ms. Whitman stood at her desk watching the scene unfold, her hands clasped tightly together. "Congratulations, Andre," she said, her voice measured but sincere. Inside, her emotions churned like stormy waters. She felt proud of his achievement, yet a familiar whisper of insecurity crept in, dark and unwelcome. Had she really helped him succeed, or had he flourished in spite of her earlier cruelty? The question nagged at her conscience. Later that day, during their one-on-one session, Andre carefully laid out his winning design, smoothing the paper with gentle, reverent touches. "I couldn't have done this without your help, Ms. Whitman," he said softly, his eyes focused on the artwork. "Your feedback really made me think differently about composition and color. It helped me be braver with my choices." Laura felt her throat tighten, a knot of emotion making it hard to swallow. Here was this talented young man thanking her, when months ago she had torn his work in half, letting her own bitterness poison their relationship. "The mural." Andre's voice grew quiet, almost dreamlike. "I'm dedicating it to my mom. She always said art could bring people together, tell their stories." He traced the intricate patterns with his finger, following each curve and line with care. "Sometimes I imagine her seeing it. She would have loved the way the colors flow into each other, how each section tells a different story, but they're all connected like threads in a tapestry." Ms. Whitman watched him, struck by his gentle strength. Despite losing his mother, despite her own harsh treatment, he had remained focused and kind, never letting bitterness take root. She felt a deep admiration for his resilience mixed with sharp shame at her previous behavior, remembering how she had once tried to dim his light. "She taught me that art isn't just about technique," Andre continued, his voice warm with memory. "It's about heart, about sharing something meaningful with others." He looked up at Ms. Whitman, his eyes clear and earnest. "That's what I'm trying to do with this mural." Laura nodded, unable to speak past the emotion lodged in her chest. She saw now that Andre's success wasn't about her at all. It was about his dedication, his talent, and the loving foundation his mother had built, brick by careful brick. That evening, Laura sat alone at her desk, the classroom quiet except for the soft hum of the heating system and the occasional shuffle of papers in the wind from the vent. She thought about Andre's journey, from that first cruel critique to today's celebration, seeing it with new eyes. She considered her role in his story, not as the master teacher she'd imagined herself to be, but as someone who might still find redemption through genuine mentorship, learning as much from her student as he had from her. Ms. Whitman's hands trembled as she sat across from Principal Roberts. The morning light streaming through his office window did nothing to warm the chill that had settled in her bones. Her throat felt tight, and she fought the urge to fidget with the buttons on her cardigan. "This is serious, Laura," Principal Roberts said, sliding his tablet across the desk. On the screen was an email detailing her past behavior toward Andre, including accusations of racial bias. The words seemed to blur together as panic rose in her chest. The competition board received this yesterday along with a video. Laura's stomach dropped as she watched the footage of herself tearing Andre's painting in half. The harsh fluorescent lights of her classroom cast an unflattering glare on her angry face as she destroyed a student's work. She could hear her own harsh words echoing in the background, making her wince with each syllable. I can explain," she stammered, but the words felt hollow even to her. Her fingers twisted in her lap, searching for an explanation that wouldn't come. "The board is still deciding how to proceed," Principal Roberts said, his disappointment evident. "But this reflects poorly on our school." He removed his glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose, a gesture that spoke volumes about his weariness with the situation. By lunch, whispers followed Laura through the hallways. Students quickly looked away when she passed, and fellow teachers gave her a wide berth. The click of her heels against the linoleum felt deafening in the sudden silence that surrounded her. During their afternoon session, Andre burst into the art room, his face tight with anger. "How could you?" he demanded. "Was helping me just an act? Were you planning this all along?" His hands were clenched at his sides, shoulders rigid with betrayal. "What? No, Andre, I didn't send that email," Laura protested, rising from her desk. Her heart raced as she saw the hurt in his eyes. Then who did? Who else would have that video? Andre's voice cracked. "I actually thought you'd changed. I trusted you." His words hit her like physical blows, each one striking deeper than the last. "Andre, please listen." "Save it," he cut her off, gathering his supplies. "I don't want your help anymore." The door slammed behind him, leaving Laura alone in the suddenly too quiet room. The echo of his departure seemed to reverberate through her bones. That evening, Laura sat in her dark apartment, a glass of untouched water on the coffee table before her. The day's events played on loop in her mind. The principal's stern face, Andre's hurt expression, the damning video evidence of her worst moment as a teacher. The city lights flickered outside her window, casting strange shadows on her walls. She buried her face in her hands, the weight of her past actions finally catching up to her. All the progress they'd made, all the trust they'd built, it had shattered like the pieces of that first painting she'd so carelessly destroyed. The silence of her apartment pressed in around her, broken only by the soft sound of her ragged breathing. Laura's heels clicked against the polished floor as she made her way to the competition board's conference room. Her heart pounded against her ribs like a trapped bird, but she kept her chin up. This wasn't about saving her job anymore. It was about doing what was right, about finally being the teacher she should have been from the start. Inside, 5 board members sat around a large oak table, their expressions stern and unyielding. Papers and tablets lay scattered before them, evidence of their scrutiny. Laura took a deep breath and began speaking before her courage could fail her, before the familiar whispers of self-doubt could creep back in. "I'm here because I need to tell you the truth," she said, her voice steady despite her trembling hands. The morning sunlight streaming through the windows caught the silver threads in her dark hair. "The video you received shows exactly what happened. I did tear up Andre Coleman's artwork, and I treated him unfairly from the start. There's no excuse for my behavior." The board chairman leaned forward, his glasses catching the light. "Why should we continue considering his submission given these circumstances?" "Because Andre's talent has nothing to do with my mistakes," Laura replied, conviction strengthening her voice. "I let my own insecurities and past failures cloud my judgment, but his work, it's extraordinary. He creates art that tells stories of hope and healing, inspired by his late mother's legacy. Every piece speaks to the heart." She pulled out her tablet with slightly shaking fingers and showed them photos of Andre's recent work. "This is what he's capable of. Look at the depth, the emotion he captures. My poor behavior shouldn't diminish his opportunity to be recognized for his talent. He deserves that much." "Ms. Whitman," a board member interjected, her tone sharp as a knife's edge, "how can we be sure your mentorship hasn't been detrimental to his development?" Laura's shoulders straightened, steel entering her spine. "Andre has succeeded despite my initial treatment, not because of it. His progress comes from his own dedication and natural ability. I'm not here to take credit for his growth. I'm here to make sure my actions don't stand in the way of his future. He's earned this chance." After what felt like hours of questioning, the board chairman nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. "We'll review Andre's submission independently, based solely on its artistic merit." Relief flooded through Laura, but it was short-lived. As she walked out of the building into the crisp morning air, her phone buzzed. Andre's message appeared on the screen. "I don't trust you anymore. Please stay out of my work." Laura's hand dropped to her side, the weight of his words heavier than she'd expected. She stood there in the morning sun, the early spring breeze carrying the scent of nearby flowering trees, realizing that earning back Andre's trust would be far more challenging than facing the board. Some wounds, she knew, took more than good intentions to heal. Laura stood on the Coleman's doorstep, her hand hovering over the doorbell. The sprawling 2-story house seemed to loom over her, matching the weight in her chest. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the well-maintained garden, making her feel even smaller. After a deep breath that did little to calm her racing heart, she pressed the button. Dr. Coleman opened the door, his eyebrows rising slightly at the sight of her disheveled appearance. "Ms. Whitman, this is unexpected." "I need to speak with Andre if possible," she said, trying to keep her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. He studied her for a moment, his dark eyes searching her face before stepping aside. "He's in the living room." Laura followed him inside, her steps careful on the hardwood floors. Family photos lined the walls, happy moments frozen in time. Andre sat on the plush brown couch, sketchbook in hand, colored pencils scattered around him. When he looked up, his expression hardened like clay left too long in the sun. "What are you doing here?" His voice was cold, distant, echoing off the walls. "I came to apologize," Laura said, remaining near the doorway, one hand clutching her purse strap. "I had nothing to do with that email to the competition board. But more importantly, I need to tell you how sorry I am for everything else." Andre set his sketchbook aside but said nothing, his jaw clenched tight. Laura's hands twisted together as she continued, her silver bracelet catching the light. "I was cruel to you, and you deserve to know why." She took a shaky breath that seemed to rattle in her chest. "When I was your age, I had dreams too, big ones. But my mentor, she destroyed them. Called my work worthless, said I'd never make it." She noticed Andre's expression soften slightly, the anger in his eyes giving way to something else. "When I saw your talent, it brought back all that pain. Instead of being the mentor I wished I'd had, I became exactly like her." Laura's voice cracked like thin ice. "I was jealous of your gift, your passion. You reminded me of everything I lost." Andre shifted in his seat, his guard lowering just slightly, fingers absently touching the corner of his sketchbook. "No, it doesn't," Laura agreed quickly, shame coloring her cheeks. "Nothing excuses tearing up your work or trying to break your spirit. I was wrong, completely wrong." The room fell silent except for the steady tick of a grandfather clock in the corner. Dr. Coleman stood in the doorway, arms crossed, watching the exchange carefully. Andre studied his hands for a long moment before looking up, his eyes carrying both hurt and wisdom beyond his years. "If you want to make it right, prove it. Publicly." Laura nodded, understanding the challenge in his words and the weight of responsibility they carried. "I will." Laura's hands trembled uncontrollably as she shuffled her note cards backstage, nearly dropping them twice. The persistent murmur of voices from the packed auditorium made her stomach twist into painful knots. Through gaps in the heavy curtain, she caught glimpses of familiar faces, students whispering among themselves, faculty members with concerned expressions, and the stern-looking competition board members seated rigidly in the front row, their faces etched with disapproval. Andre sat perfectly still in the middle section, his arms crossed tightly over his chest, shoulders tense. His father, Dr. Coleman, stood at the back of the room like a silent guardian, his presence both protective and intimidating. Laura's throat felt like sandpaper as she took another nervous sip of water, the liquid doing little to calm her nerves. Principal Matthews adjusted his tie and stepped onto the stage, tapping the microphone twice. "Thank you all for coming today. Ms. Whitman has requested this opportunity to address recent events concerning our art program." Laura's legs felt like lead weights as she forced herself to walk to the podium. The harsh, bright lights made her squint painfully, and for a moment, all she could see were shadowy figures swaying in her vision. She gripped the edges of the podium with white knuckles, steadying herself against the wave of dizziness that threatened to overwhelm her. "Good afternoon," she began, her voice wavering slightly despite her best efforts to sound confident. "I'm here today because I need to take responsibility for my actions." She paused, gathering her courage to look directly at Andre, whose expression remained unnervingly neutral. "Earlier this semester, I treated one of my most talented students with inexcusable cruelty and jealousy. I tore up his artwork in front of the class, destroying something precious. I tried to diminish his abilities through harsh criticism. I let my own past failures poison my role as a teacher and mentor." Tears pricked at her eyes, but she blinked them back furiously, determined to maintain her composure. "Andre Coleman showed incredible grace in the face of my behavior. His talent isn't just in his technical skills, it's in his ability to tell stories through art, to share his heart through his work in ways I'd forgotten were possible. The mural he designed honors his mother's memory and brings beauty to our community in ways that remind us all why art matters." Her voice grew stronger as she continued, drawing strength from the truth in her words. "To the competition board, please judge Andre's work on its own considerable merits. Don't let my shameful actions cast a shadow over his achievement. He deserves to be recognized for his talent, not defined by how I treated him or the controversy I created." Looking directly at Andre again, she fought to keep her voice steady. I am deeply sorry for the pain I caused you. You reminded me of everything I once loved about art. The joy of creation, the power of storytelling, the ability to touch hearts and change lives. Instead of celebrating those qualities in you, I tried to crush them out of fear and bitterness. I was wrong, and I will spend the rest of my career trying to make amends and become the teacher you deserved from the start. The silence in the auditorium was absolute, heavy with tension. Laura could hear her own heartbeat thundering in her ears like a drum. Some audience members wiped away tears with tissue papers, while others sat in stunned silence, processing her words. Andre's expression remained unreadable, his arms still crossed protectively across his chest, his eyes fixed somewhere in the distance. As Laura stepped away from the podium on shaking legs, scattered applause broke out, growing slightly stronger but remaining tentative and uncertain. She watched helplessly as Andre stood up and walked out without a word, his footsteps echoing in the quiet space, leaving her standing alone on the stage beneath the harsh lights, wondering if her public confession had made any difference at all, or if some wounds ran too deep for words to heal. Andre stood before his mural design, his hands steady as he adjusted the display. The afternoon sun streamed through the competition hall's tall windows, casting warm light across the vibrant colors of his artwork. His heart beat steadily in his chest as he made one final adjustment to the corner of his presentation board. Judges shuffled their papers at the long table in front, their expressions neutral and professional as they settled into their seats. In the back of the room, Laura Whitman slipped quietly into an empty chair, her silk scarf rustling softly as she sat down. Her heart raced as she noticed Andre's shoulders tense slightly. He'd seen her come in, though he didn't turn around. She clasped her hands in her lap, trying to make herself as small as possible, feeling like an intruder in this moment of triumph. "Good afternoon," Andre began, his voice clear and confident, carrying to every corner of the hushed room. "This mural design is called Community Spirit. It's dedicated to my mother, Maria Coleman, who taught me that art can heal and bring people together. She believed in the power of colors to speak to the soul." He gestured to the sweeping lines and bold colors of his design, his movements fluid and purposeful. "These figures represent our community coming together, supporting each other through difficult times. The butterfly motifs scattered throughout symbolize transformation and hope. Each one is painted in the colors my mother loved most." Gasps and murmurs of appreciation rippled through the audience. One judge leaned forward, adjusting her glasses for a better look, her eyes wide with wonder. Another scribbled furiously in his notebook, barely looking up from the page. Laura felt her throat tighten as Andre explained each element of the design, his words painting an even richer picture than the artwork itself. His technical skill was impressive, but it was the emotional depth that made the piece extraordinary. The way he captured light and shadow reminded her of her own early work, before fear had stolen her joy in creating. She wanted to burst with pride, yet shame held her back. Did she deserve to feel proud after how she'd treated him? "The central figure," Andre continued, pointing to a woman with outstretched arms whose face seemed to radiate warmth, "represents my mother. She used to say that art should lift people up, give them something to believe in. That's what I hope this mural will do for our community. Each brushstroke is meant to tell a story of hope." The lead judge dabbed at her eyes with a tissue, clearly moved by both the presentation and the personal story behind it. Others nodded appreciatively, completely captivated by Andre's presentation, their pens forgotten in their hands. Laura watched as Andre fielded questions from the judges with grace and insight, his responses showing wisdom beyond his years. Each thoughtful response reminded her of how wrong she'd been about him, how she'd nearly crushed such remarkable talent with her own bitterness. She could see now what she'd been too afraid to acknowledge before, his raw talent shaped by genuine passion. When the head judge stood up and announced Andre as the winner, the room erupted in applause. Dr. Coleman, sitting in the front row, beamed with pride, tears glistening in his eyes. Students from Wellington Academy jumped to their feet, cheering wildly, their excitement infectious. For the first time since his presentation began, Andre turned and looked toward the back of the room. His eyes met Laura's, And in that brief moment, something passed between them. Not quite forgiveness, but perhaps understanding. A small smile tugged at the corner of his mouth, acknowledging her presence. Before Laura could react, Andre was surrounded by well-wishers, disappearing into a sea of congratulations and extended hands. She remained in her seat, watching the celebration unfold, knowing that somehow they'd both been transformed by this journey. The next morning, Ms. Whitman walked into her classroom earlier than usual, her steps lighter after Andre's competition victory. She paused at her desk, noticing something that hadn't been there the day before. A large, carefully wrapped package in brown paper secured with twine. Her hands trembled slightly as she unfolded the wrapping, her heart beating faster with each layer she removed. When the paper fell away, she gasped. Before her stood a stunning painting of a sunrise, but not an ordinary one. The canvas showed fragments of light breaking through darkness, each piece telling its own story of struggle and hope, like memories scattered across time. The colors were bold yet delicate, deep purples and blues giving way to brilliant oranges and golds, blending and separating like a dance of light. The fractured pieces seemed to dance across the canvas, some sharp and jagged, others soft and flowing, creating a rhythm that pulled the eye from one section to the next. It reminded her of stained glass, beautiful in its brokenness, each fragment holding its own story while contributing to the whole. Attached to the corner was a simple note, written in Andre's neat handwriting. Laura's eyes welled up as she read Andre's words. "Thank you for helping me see the light. Andre." Her fingers brushed against the paper, tracing the letters as if to make them more real. She stood there for several minutes, unable to look away, her reflection visible in the glass frame. In those broken shards of light, she saw her own journey reflected, the darkness of her bitterness, the cracks in her confidence, and now, the possibility of redemption shining through like the first rays of dawn. With careful hands, she lifted the painting and carried it to the most prominent wall in her classroom, right where the morning sun would hit it best. As she hung it, she noticed how the morning light caught the golden highlights, making them shimmer and dance across the canvas like living things. Students began trickling in for first period, their usual morning chatter falling quiet as they noticed the new artwork. Many stopped to admire the new addition to their classroom, their faces reflecting wonder and curiosity. "Ms. Whitman, that's beautiful," one student remarked, moving closer to study the details. "Did Andre paint it?" "Yes," she replied softly, pride warming her voice. "Yes, he did." "It looks like broken pieces coming together," another student observed, tilting her head thoughtfully. "Like a puzzle solving itself." Laura nodded, touching the frame gently, feeling its solid presence beneath her fingers. "Sometimes the most beautiful things come from broken places," she said, her voice carrying a new wisdom. Standing before the painting, Laura felt something she hadn't experienced in years, a sense of peace settling deep in her soul. The weight of her past mistakes seemed lighter somehow, as if the painting's light was washing them away. She whispered to herself, her words barely audible in the quiet classroom. Maybe it's not too late to start again. The art wing buzzed with excitement as people gathered for the private unveiling of Andre's mural. Students whispered among themselves while faculty members chatted with Dr. Coleman near the covered wall, their voices creating a gentle hum of anticipation. Ms. Whitman lingered at the back of the room, her hands clasped tightly together, knuckles white with nervous energy. She watched Andre standing proudly next to his father, accepting handshakes and well wishes from everyone around him, his smile genuine and warm. The principal stepped forward, her heels clicking against the polished floor, tapping a spoon against her glass to quiet the crowd. "Today, we celebrate not just artistic talent, but the power of perseverance and growth," she announced, nodding toward Andre with genuine admiration in her eyes. Two students pulled the cloth away with a dramatic flourish, revealing the mural in all its glory. Gasps filled the room, followed by a moment of awestruck silence. The massive piece stretched across the wall, its colors dancing with life and energy, each brushstroke telling its own story. Andre had painted a scene that blended urban landscapes with natural elements, trees growing through concrete, flowers blooming from broken windows, and people of all ages working together to rebuild their community. The attention to detail was remarkable, from the weathered brick textures to the hopeful expressions on the painted faces. "It's extraordinary," someone whispered, and murmurs of agreement spread through the crowd like ripples in a pond. Dr. Coleman placed a proud hand on his son's shoulder, his eyes glistening with emotion as people stepped forward to congratulate Andre. Laura stayed back, studying the details of the mural, her artist's eye catching every nuance and subtle message. She could see elements of their shared journey in the piece, the broken parts being made whole again, the light breaking through darkness, the careful balance of shadow and illumination. Her throat tightened with emotion, and she blinked rapidly to clear her vision. As the crowd began to thin, Andre unexpectedly made his way toward her, weaving between small groups of lingering admirers. Laura straightened, unsure what to expect, her heart beating a little faster. He held a small, worn sketchbook in his hands, its corners softened with use. "Ms. Whitman," he said softly, extending the book toward her, "you taught me how to grow, even when it wasn't easy. Thank you." His voice carried the weight of their shared struggles and triumphs. Laura accepted the sketchbook with trembling hands, feeling the familiar texture of the cover. "Andre, she began, but he cut her off with a gentle smile that reminded her of his mother's warmth. "I know," he said simply, the two words carrying volumes of understanding between them. The room gradually emptied, leaving Laura alone with the mural. She stood before it, taking in every detail, from the smallest flower petal to the broadest sweep of sky. Her fingers traced the edge of the painting, feeling the texture of the wall beneath, connecting physically with the art that had brought such change to her life. In this quiet moment, she made a silent promise to herself, to embrace this new chapter in her life, where teaching and creating could coexist with joy rather than bitterness. The afternoon light streamed through the windows, casting a golden glow across the mural, as if nature itself was blessing this moment of transformation. Ms. Whitman sat in her dimly lit home studio, surrounded by dusty art supplies and forgotten dreams. Cobwebs clung to the corners of easels, and half-empty paint tubes lay scattered across her workspace. Her eyes fixed on an unfinished painting propped against the wall, a piece she'd abandoned years ago when criticism had crushed her spirit. Above her desk, Andre's fractured sunrise painting caught the evening light, its colors seeming to pulse with possibility, each brushstroke a testament to perseverance. She reached out to touch the canvas of her old work, fingers tracing the dried paint and feeling every ridge and valley. "Maybe it's time," she whispered to herself, though doubt made her hand tremble. The silence of the room pressed in around her. Picking up a brush felt foreign, like greeting an old friend who'd become a stranger. The wooden handle was smooth but uncomfortable in her grip. She dipped it in paint, hesitating before bringing it to the canvas. The first stroke was clumsy, uncertain, almost childlike. The second a little steadier, more purposeful. As she worked, memories of Andre's quiet determination flooded back. His gentle spirit seemed to fill the studio. She remembered how he'd remained focused despite her harsh criticism, how he'd turned pain into beauty through his art. "If he could do it," she murmured, wiping her palms on her smock, "so can I." Her hand moved more confidently now, adding layers of color to the faded piece. Each new shade breathed life into the canvas. When doubts crept in, whispers of past failures and cruel critiques, she thought of Andre's resilience. She remembered his words about his mother, about how art was about more than perfection. It was about telling your story, about leaving pieces of your heart on the canvas. Tears welled in her eyes as she confronted the bitterness she'd carried for so long, like heavy stones in her pockets. Each brushstroke felt like letting go of an old wound, replacing pain with possibility. The painting began to transform under her touch, imperfect but alive with renewed purpose, each mistake becoming part of its beauty. Hours passed unnoticed as she worked, the outside world fading away until only she and the canvas existed. When she finally stepped back, exhausted but lighter somehow, the studio had grown dark except for her desk lamp casting a warm glow. Paint smudged her hands and clothes. The painting wasn't finished, but it was different now, filled with touches of hope she'd forgotten she could create, alive with colors that spoke of renewal. Ms. Whitman smiled, really smiled for the first time in years. Her cheeks ached from the unfamiliar movement. The painting wasn't perfect, far from it, but in its flaws and fresh strokes, she saw something she'd lost long ago, a beginning. And beginnings, she was learning, were the most beautiful kind of art. Laura sat in her car outside the school board meeting room, gripping the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles turned white. The invitation from Dr. Coleman had surprised her, and now anxiety churned in her stomach like a storm. Taking a deep breath, she checked her reflection in the rearview mirror, smoothed her blazer with trembling hands, and forced herself to walk inside. The boardroom was intimidating with its dark wood panels and formal atmosphere. The afternoon sun filtering through Venetian blinds cast striped shadows across the polished table where board members sat, their expressions unreadable as statues. Dr. Coleman stood as she entered, greeting her with a warm smile that helped ease some of her tension, and gestured to an empty chair near the front. "Thank you all for coming," Dr. Coleman began, his voice steady and confident. "Today, I'd like to discuss expanding our arts program." He outlined detailed plans for new facilities and equipment, complete with budget projections, but then his eyes found Laura's. "Most importantly, I propose creating an after-school mentorship program for aspiring artists, something our students desperately need." Laura's heart skipped a beat as Dr. Coleman continued, his words sending a jolt through her. "And I recommend Ms. Whitman to lead this initiative, given her recent success." The room fell silent as a tomb. Laura felt her cheeks flush hot as all eyes turned to her, and she fought the urge to shrink into her chair. I'm not sure I'm qualified," she stammered, her voice barely above a whisper, years of self-doubt flooding back. "On the contrary," Dr. Coleman said firmly, standing straighter, "I've watched your journey with Andre Coleman this year. Your growth as a mentor has been remarkable. You've shown that you understand both the technical and emotional aspects of nurturing young artists, something that can't be taught." Board members nodded in agreement, their earlier stern expressions softening. One woman with silver-streaked hair spoke up, leaning forward eagerly. "The transformation in Andre's work under your guidance has been extraordinary. We've all seen the difference." Laura's hands trembled in her lap as she twisted a tissue between her fingers. "But my past behavior shows that you understand the importance of second chances," Dr. Coleman interrupted gently, his eyes kind. "Who better to guide young artists than someone who knows both struggle and redemption? Someone who can truly empathize with their fears and doubts?" The board voted unanimously to approve the program, their hands raising one by one like a wave of support. Laura sat there, overwhelmed by their confidence in her, wondering if she was dreaming. A mix of excitement and nervousness fluttered in her chest like startled birds as she accepted the position with a shaky smile. After the meeting dispersed, Dr. Coleman pulled her aside in the quiet hallway. His expression was serious but kind, reminding her of a father about to give important advice. "This program isn't just for the students, it's for you too, Laura. Don't waste this second chance. Use it to become the mentor you needed when you were young." Laura nodded, feeling the weight and promise of his words settle into her bones like truth. The afternoon sun streamed through the art room windows as Ms. Whitman arranged chairs in a circle, taking extra care to space them evenly. Her hands trembled slightly as she placed fresh sketchbooks at each seat, adjusting their angles until they were perfectly aligned. 5 students had signed up for the mentorship program, a smaller group than she'd hoped for, but perhaps exactly what she needed, and she wanted everything to be perfect for this new beginning. Marisol was the first to arrive, clutching her worn pencil case close to her chest like a shield. The other students filtered in quietly, looking uncertain but curious, their footsteps echoing in the large room. Once they were all seated, their expectant faces turned toward her. Laura took a deep breath and steadied herself against her desk. "Before we begin," she said, her voice soft but steady, fighting against the nervous flutter in her stomach, "I want to share something with you." She told them about Andre, about her jealousy and mistakes, and about learning to be better. Her voice cracked slightly as she spoke of her own transformation. Sometimes our greatest lessons come from our biggest failures, she admitted, meeting each student's eyes in turn. The students listened intently, their expressions shifting from uncertainty to understanding. Some nodded, while others leaned forward in their chairs. When she finished, the room felt lighter somehow, as if her honesty had cleared the air and opened a door between them. Now, she smiled, feeling more confident than she had in years. Let's create something together. The students spread out around the room, each finding their own space to work, the soft scratch of pencils filling the air. Laura moved between them, offering gentle suggestions and words of encouragement, careful to maintain the delicate balance between guidance and freedom. When she reached Marisol's desk, she noticed the girl repeatedly erasing her work, her frustration evident in the way her shoulders hunched forward. "May I?" Laura asked, pulling up a chair beside her. Marisol nodded shyly, showing her a half-finished sketch of a garden scene, smudges from repeated erasures ghosting the paper. "It's not good enough," Marisol whispered, her eyes downcast, fingers fidgeting with her pencil. "You know," Laura said, leaning in conspiratorially, "that's exactly what I used to tell myself." She pointed to specific elements in Marisol's drawing, her finger tracing the lines without touching them. "Look at how you've captured the light here, and the way these flowers seem to dance across the page. That's your unique vision, something only you can create." As the session continued, Laura watched Marisol's confidence grow with each stroke of her pencil. The girl's eraser remained untouched as she added bold strokes to her drawing, her movements becoming more assured. Around the room, other students were equally engrossed in their work, occasionally sharing encouraging words with each other, creating a gentle buzz of creativity and support. Laura felt a warmth spread through her chest as she observed them, remembering her own journey from bitterness to healing. This wasn't just about teaching technique. It was about nurturing creativity and building confidence, about helping these young artists believe in themselves. She saw pieces of herself in each of them, their doubts, their dreams, their determination, and recognized the privilege of guiding them forward. When the session ended, the students packed up their supplies, chatting excitedly about their projects and making plans to work on them at home. Marisol lingered behind, carefully placing her drawing in her folder, handling it with newfound pride. "Thank you, Ms. Whitman," she said softly before joining the others, her smile small but genuine. As the last student left, Laura stood in the middle of the room, surrounded by the evidence of their creative endeavors. Student artwork lay scattered across the desks, and the air still hummed with creative energy. Sunlight painted golden patterns on the floor, and for the first time in years she felt truly at home in her own skin. She smiled, touching one of the chairs gently, knowing she had finally found where she belonged, not just as an artist, but as a mentor who could make a difference. The storage room was thick with dust as Ms. Whitman sorted through old boxes. Her fingers brushed against something familiar, a canvas wrapped in brown paper, yellowed with age. Her heart skipped a beat as she unwrapped it, her hands trembling slightly. There it was, the painting she'd submitted to the Metropolitan Art Exhibition 15 years ago. Bold strokes of red and orange danced across the canvas, depicting a woman reaching toward a distant light. Swirls of darkness surrounded the figure, making her struggle more poignant. She remembered how proud she'd felt of this piece, until her mentor had torn it apart. "Amateur, derivative, you'll never make it as an artist," he had said, his words cutting deep into her confidence. The memory made her hands shake as she held the painting. She could still picture his dismissive wave, the way he'd barely looked at her work before crushing her dreams. The next afternoon, Laura waited nervously in her classroom for Andre, straightening items on her desk repeatedly to keep her hands busy. When he arrived, she gestured to the painting propped on an easel, trying to keep her voice steady. "I found this yesterday," she said quietly. "It's something I painted years ago." Andre studied the piece intently, his eyes taking in every detail, moving methodically across the canvas. Laura found herself telling him everything, about the exhibition, her mentor's cruel words, how she'd locked the painting away and nearly given up on art entirely. The words tumbled out, carrying years of buried pain. "You know what I see?" Andre said thoughtfully, tilting his head as he continued to examine the work. I see someone trying to break free. The technique might not be perfect, but the emotion is real. That counts for something, actually, that counts for everything. His words touched something deep inside her, melting a wall she hadn't even realized she'd built. I was so sure it was terrible, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Not terrible, Andre shook his head firmly. Just unfinished, like a chapter in your story. You had to go through this to get where you are now. Sometimes the hardest moments shape us the most. Laura looked at the painting again, seeing it through new eyes. The reaching figure seemed less desperate now, more hopeful. The darkness around her appeared less threatening, more like a challenge to overcome. Maybe Andre was right. Maybe this hadn't been a failure, but a necessary step forward. That evening, Laura carefully hung the painting in her studio, taking time to position it just right. She stepped back, letting out a long breath. For the first time in 15 years, she felt no shame looking at it. Instead, she felt something else. Acceptance. And perhaps, she thought, a tiny spark of pride beginning to return. The art room basked in late afternoon sunlight as Ms. Whitman and Andre set up their supplies. Large sheets of paper covered the tables, and sketch pencils rolled across the surface as they began brainstorming ideas for the mentorship program's mural. The warm glow filtering through the windows cast long shadows across their workspace, creating an almost magical atmosphere. I was thinking, Andre said, his pencil moving confidently across the paper. We could show hands reaching upward, breaking through chains that transform into butterflies. His sketch took shape quickly, bold, flowing lines capturing the essence of transformation. Each stroke seemed to carry the weight of his vision, bringing the concept to life with remarkable clarity. Ms. Whitman nodded, studying his work with genuine admiration. That's beautiful, Andre. The symbolism is perfect. She picked up her own pencil, adding gentle curves to the design. Maybe we could add these flowing lines here, representing growth and movement? Her additions complemented his work naturally, as if their artistic styles were meant to blend together. Andre's eyes lit up and he leaned forward eagerly. Yes, exactly. And look. He sketched rapidly. If we blend your lines with this pattern here, it creates a sense of unity. His enthusiasm was contagious as he demonstrated how the elements could flow together seamlessly. As they worked, Ms. Whitman couldn't help but marvel at Andre's confidence. Gone was the quiet, guarded student from the beginning of the semester. In his place stood a young artist who knew his worth, who carried himself with quiet assurance and creative purpose. Remember when you tore up my painting? Andre asked suddenly, but his tone held no bitterness. I was so angry then, but now I understand you were fighting your own battles. His words carried a maturity that touched her deeply. Ms. Whitman's hand paused over the sketch, her heart heavy with remembered regret. I was wrong, Andre. So wrong. But watching you grow, seeing your determination, it helped me face my own fears about art. Her voice softened with emotion as she spoke. They continued working, adding layers to the design. Andre shared stories about his mother's murals, while Ms. Whitman opened up about her early days as an artist. Their conversation flowed naturally, punctuated by the soft scratch of pencils and occasional bursts of creative excitement. The afternoon light slowly shifted, casting everything in warm amber tones. What if we added this element here? Ms. Whitman suggested, sketching a series of interconnected circles. Her hand moved with renewed confidence, no longer held back by old fears. Perfect, Andre replied, immediately building on her idea. It ties everything together. He added his own flourishes to the design, each contribution strengthening their shared vision. The mural design took shape beneath their hands, a powerful representation of their parallel journeys. Broken chains transformed into soaring birds, while delicate lines wove through the composition, connecting moments of struggle with triumph. Every element seemed to tell a story of transformation and hope. As they finished the first layer, Ms. Whitman stepped back, taking in their work with misty eyes. Thank you for teaching me as much as I've taught you, she said softly, her voice full of genuine gratitude. Andre smiled, his eyes on the mural, pride and contentment evident in his expression. We've both come a long way. The setting sun caught the edge of their design, making the pencil lines gleam like silver. Ms. Whitman smoothed the fabric of her skirt as she settled into one of the plush leather chairs facing Dr. Coleman's desk. The office was enveloped in a tranquil silence, save for the gentle hum of the air conditioning system. Warm afternoon light filtered through the towering windows, casting long, angular shadows across the polished wood floor. "Thank you for meeting with me," she began, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Dr. Coleman nodded, his expression neutral yet attentive, inviting her to continue. "I wanted to properly thank you," Ms. Whitman went on, her voice steady despite the evident nerves underlying her words. "The opportunity you gave me to mentor Andre, it changed everything. But first, I need to apologize for my behavior at the beginning of the semester." She took a deep, steadying breath before pressing on. "My actions were inexcusable. I let my own bitterness and insecurities cloud my judgment and affect how I treated Andre. I was stuck in the shadows of my past failures, and I wrongly took that out on him." Dr. Coleman leaned forward slightly, his eyes intently studying her face. "Go on," he encouraged in a quiet, measured tone. "Working with Andre has taught me so much about myself, about teaching, about art." Ms. Whitman's voice grew stronger and more resolute as she spoke. "He helped me rediscover the very passion that first drew me to this field. I'm deeply sorry for how I treated him initially." A moment of silence passed before Dr. Coleman responded. "Ms. Whitman, your actions did indeed hurt Andre deeply." His words, while firm, were not unkind. "However, what impressed me most was your willingness to change. You didn't just offer a simple apology, you transformed your entire approach to teaching." He stood and moved towards the window, gazing out at the city skyline. "The mentorship program you're running now is helping dozens of students find their creative voice through art. That's precisely the kind of meaningful impact I had hoped to see. Your platform as a teacher gives you incredible power to shape young minds," he continued, turning to face her once more. "I challenge you to keep using that influence to lift others up, not tear them down." Ms. Whitman nodded, feeling the sting of tears in her eyes. "I will," she promised, her voice thick with emotion. "Andre's talent and resilience showed me what's possible when we nurture creativity instead of stifling it. He's going to do remarkable things," Dr. Coleman smiled warmly, "and you've played a pivotal part in that journey. That's something to be deeply proud of." He extended his hand to her. "Consider this a fresh start, Ms. Whitman." She grasped his hand, feeling the warmth of acceptance in his firm grip. As she stood to leave his office, the weight of guilt she had carried for months finally lifted from her shoulders. A small, hopeful smile crossed her face as she realized she had earned not just his forgiveness but his respect. Ms. Whitman stood in her studio, studying the painting she'd chosen for submission. The canvas burst with deep blues and vibrant oranges, swirling together in a pattern that reminded her of breaking waves at sunset. She traced her fingers along the textured surface, feeling each brushstroke that represented a step in her journey back to herself. The paint was thick in places, thin in others, creating a depth that spoke of both struggle and triumph. "It's time," she whispered to herself, carefully wrapping the canvas in protective material. Her hands moved with practiced precision, though her heart fluttered with uncertainty. The local art gallery was quieter than she expected when she arrived. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows, dancing across the polished floors and casting long shadows that stretched like reaching fingers. Her hands trembled slightly as she carried her wrapped canvas through the entrance, the weight of it both familiar and strange. Other artists moved about the space, delivering their submissions. Some looked confident, striding purposefully with their work, others nervous like her, clutching their pieces close. A young woman smiled warmly as she passed, making Laura feel unexpectedly welcome in a world she'd avoided for so long. The submission office was tucked away in a corner, bathed in soft, natural light. Laura unwrapped her painting with careful movements, her heart pounding against her ribs. The curator, A woman with kind eyes and silver-streaked hair pulled back in an elegant bun, stepped forward to examine the piece, adjusting her glasses as she leaned in. "This is quite remarkable," the curator said, leaning in closer, her finger hovering over the swirls of color. "The emotion here is palpable. The way you've layered these colors, it's bold. Very bold. There's something quite raw and honest about it." Laura felt her cheeks flush with pride, a warmth spreading through her chest. "Thank you," she managed, her voice barely above a whisper, fighting back the sting of happy tears. As she walked through the gallery afterward, she found herself lingering near other submissions, drinking in the variety of styles and expressions. Each piece told its own story, just as hers did. For the first time in years, she felt like she belonged in this world again, not as an outsider looking in, but as an artist among artists. Back home, Laura stood in her studio gazing at a fresh blank canvas she'd just mounted on the wall. The white surface seemed to pulse with possibility rather than intimidate her as it once had. Afternoon light filtered through the windows, casting a golden glow across her workspace. She reached for her brushes, their familiar weight in her hand feeling like coming home, ready to begin again with renewed purpose. The city art fair bustled with energy as Ms. Whitman made her way through the crowded venue. Sunlight streamed through the large windows, illuminating the artwork that lined the walls. The familiar scent of paint and varnish filled the air, bringing back memories of her own artistic journey. Her heart swelled with pride when she spotted Andre's mural commanding attention in the center of the exhibition. The piece was even more striking here than in the school. Its vibrant colors and intricate details drew visitors like a magnet, the bold strokes and delicate shading working together in perfect harmony. People gathered around it, pointing and discussing the various elements that made it special, their excited whispers creating a constant hum of appreciation. "Ms. Whitman," Andre called out, waving from across the room, his face beaming with excitement. "I'm so glad you came." She smiled warmly, noting how confident he looked in his neat blazer, his shoulders straight and proud. Gone was the quiet, uncertain student from the beginning of the semester. In his place stood a young artist ready to share his vision with the world, his eyes bright with purpose. The crowd hushed as Andre stepped up to give his speech. He stood tall, his voice clear and strong as he began to speak about the mural, his hands moving expressively as he addressed the attentive audience. "This piece is dedicated to my mother," he said, his eyes bright with emotion. "She taught me that art has the power to bring people together, to tell stories that need to be told." He paused, scanning the audience, his gaze touching each face before him. "But there's someone else who helped shape this journey. My teacher, Ms. Whitman, taught me how to believe in myself, even when it was hard for both of us. She showed me that sometimes the toughest critics can become your strongest supporters." Laura felt tears well up in her eyes, her hands clasped tightly together. She hadn't expected this public acknowledgement. Around her, people turned to look, but she barely noticed them. All she could focus on was the genuine gratitude in Andre's voice and the remarkable artwork before her, a testament to their shared growth. The applause that followed felt distant as she wiped away tears, her hands trembling slightly. In that moment, all the doubt, bitterness, and regret she'd carried for so long seemed to dissolve into the warm afternoon light. She finally understood that her journey had led her exactly where she needed to be, guiding young artists toward their dreams instead of dwelling on her past. After the crowds began to thin, Laura found herself standing alone in front of the mural. She reached out, gently running her fingers along its edges, feeling the texture of the paint beneath her fingertips. The colors seemed to dance in the fading daylight, each shade telling its own story. A smile spread across her face as she took in every detail, every brushstroke that told their shared story of growth and redemption, knowing that this was just the beginning of her new chapter as a mentor. Ms. Whitman sat at her desk, tapping her pen against a blank piece of paper. Around her, the mentorship workspace hummed with creative energy as students worked on their projects. Soft afternoon light filtered through the windows, catching the vibrant colors of Andre's fractured sunrise painting on the wall. The piece had become a centerpiece of inspiration for the other students, its message of hope rising from brokenness, touching everyone who saw it. She glanced up at the artwork, drawing inspiration from its bold strokes and meaningful symbolism. The way Andre had captured both pain and possibility in each brushstroke still amazed her. Taking a deep breath, she began to write. Dear Andre, I've started this letter a dozen times trying to find the perfect words. But maybe that's fitting. Our journey together started with imperfection too. Her hand trembled slightly as she continued writing, pouring her heart onto the page. She described how her bitterness had clouded her judgment, how her own past failures had made her resist seeing his talent. The words flowed more easily now, honest and raw, each sentence carrying years of regret and newfound understanding. Your resilience taught me more than I ever taught you, she wrote. When I tore up your painting that day, I thought I was showing strength. Instead, you showed me what real strength looks like, the kind that comes from forgiveness and grace. Students chatted quietly around her as she wrote, their creative energy filling the room with possibility. But Ms. Whitman remained focused on her task, barely noticing the gentle buzz of conversation or the scratch of pencils on paper. She described how mentoring him had rekindled her love for art and teaching, how his dedication had inspired her to face her own fears and embrace the vulnerability that comes with creating. Thank you for not giving up on art, even when I gave you every reason to. Your courage helped me find mine again. She finished the letter with a simple closing, signing her name at the bottom with a slight flourish. After reading it over once more, checking each word carefully, she carefully folded the paper and slipped it into Andre's sketchbook, which sat waiting for his next session. Her fingers lingered for a moment on the cover, remembering how far they'd both come. During that afternoon's mentorship program, Ms. Whitman tried to act natural as Andre collected his materials, though her stomach fluttered with nervous energy. Her heart beat faster as he picked up the sketchbook, tucking it into his backpack without noticing the letter inside. She watched him leave, hoping her words would bridge the final gap between them. Later that evening, Ms. Whitman settled into her home studio, surrounded by the familiar smell of paint and canvas. The setting sun cast long shadows across her workspace as she positioned a fresh canvas on her easel. Her hands felt steady as she picked up her brush, ready to begin something new. The evening light reminded her of Andre's sunrise painting, and she smiled at the connection. The weight of unspoken words had lifted from her shoulders. Whether Andre accepted her letter's message or not, she knew she had finally expressed what needed to be said. She dipped her brush in paint and began to work, feeling truly at peace for the first time in years. Each stroke felt like another step forward on her own journey of healing. The afternoon sun streamed through the classroom windows, casting a warm glow over the bustling art space. Ms. Whitman's classroom had transformed into a haven of creativity, with students scattered around working on various projects. The walls were covered with colorful artwork, each piece telling its own unique story. The air carried the familiar scent of acrylic paint and freshly sharpened pencils, a fragrance that had become synonymous with possibility. Marisol stood at the front of the room, her hands clasped nervously as she presented her latest painting. The piece burst with vibrant reds and yellows, depicting traditional dancers from her family's heritage. Her voice, once barely above a whisper, now carried clearly across the room. The brush strokes were bold and confident, showing how far she'd come in her technical skills. My grandmother used to tell me stories about these celebrations, Marisol explained, her confidence growing with each word. I wanted to capture the joy and energy she described, the way the dancers' skirts would twirl and catch the light of the setting sun. The other students listened intently, offering encouraging nods and genuine praise. Several hands shot up with thoughtful questions about her technique and inspiration. Ms. Whitman watched from her desk, her heart swelling with pride. She remembered how Marisol had barely spoken during her first few sessions, hiding behind her canvas and second-guessing every brushstroke. The transformation was remarkable. After class, as the other students packed up their supplies and chatted about weekend plans, Marisol approached Ms. Whitman's desk. Her eyes shone with gratitude, and she clutched her sketchbook close to her chest. Ms. Whitman, she said softly, I just wanted to thank you. Before this program, I never felt brave enough to share my art with anyone, but you've created this space where I feel safe to be myself, where I can tell my family's stories through my paintings. Laura felt tears prick at her eyes. She thought about her own journey, how far she'd come from the bitter, discouraged teacher who had torn up Andre's painting months ago. The mentorship program had given her something she never expected, a chance to heal while helping others grow. Each student's success felt like a personal victory. "You did all the hard work, Marisol," Ms. Whitman replied warmly. "I just provided the space. Your talent and dedication did the rest." As she tidied up the classroom later, organizing paintbrushes and straightening easels, Ms. Whitman paused to look at Andre's fractured sunrise painting. The piece that had once symbolized her path to redemption now represented something even more meaningful, the beginning of a legacy that would touch countless young artists' lives. She traced her fingers along the frame, remembering the moment that had changed everything. The room around her buzzed with creative energy, even in its emptiness. Paint-splattered tables and half-finished canvases told stories of discovery and growth. Student artwork filled every available space, each piece a testament to courage and self-expression. She smiled, knowing that this space had become exactly what she needed it to be. Not just a classroom, but a sanctuary for artistic expression and personal transformation. A place where young artists could spread their wings and soar. Ms. Whitman stood backstage in the school auditorium, her hands trembling slightly as she reviewed her notes one last time. Through the curtain, she could hear the buzz of conversation as students, parents, and faculty members filled the seats. Her heart raced, but this time the nervousness felt different, more like anticipation than fear. She smoothed down her carefully chosen navy blazer, a gesture that helped calm her racing thoughts. Principal Roberts introduced her with warmth in his voice, and Ms. Whitman walked onto the stage, her footsteps echoing in the sudden quiet. The bright lights illuminated hundreds of faces looking up at her expectantly, some familiar, others unknown, but all waiting to hear her story. She took a deep breath, placed her notes on the podium, and began to speak, her fingers lightly gripping the wooden edges for support. "A year ago, I stood in my classroom, bitter about my failed art career and convinced I had nothing left to give," she said, her voice growing stronger with each word. "I let my disappointments poison my ability to see potential in others, especially in a talented young student named Andre Coleman." She paused, letting the weight of those words settle over the audience. The audience listened intently as she described her journey, from tearing up Andre's painting to learning valuable lessons about humility and redemption through mentoring him. Her voice cracked slightly when she spoke about how his resilience had inspired her to face her own fears and start painting again. The memory of that turning point made her hands steady as she continued. "Art isn't just about creating beautiful things," she continued, gesturing to the student artwork displayed on easels beside the stage, each piece carefully chosen to showcase the program's diverse talents. "It's about healing, growth, and having the courage to be vulnerable. Through Andre's forgiveness and the success of our mentorship program, I've learned that sometimes our greatest failures can lead to our most meaningful transformations." As she spoke about the power of perseverance and the importance of believing in oneself, she noticed several students wiping away tears. In the front row, Marisol nodded enthusiastically, her eyes shining with understanding, while other mentorship program students sat up straighter, their faces glowing with pride. The connection between teacher and students was almost palpable in the air. "To every student who doubts their abilities or feels afraid to share their voice," Ms. Whitman said, her voice filled with emotion, looking directly into the sea of young faces before her. "Remember that creativity takes courage. Your art matters. Your story matters. And it's never too late to begin again." Her words rang through the auditorium with conviction and hope. When she finished speaking, the auditorium erupted in applause. Students and faculty rose to their feet, creating a wave of standing ovations that moved through the crowd like a tide of appreciation. Ms. Whitman felt tears welling in her eyes as she stepped away from the podium, overwhelmed by the response. As she descended the stage stairs, students and teachers approached her, many with tears in their eyes and warm smiles on their faces. They shared how her words had touched them, how her honesty had given them hope, each person adding their own story to the tapestry of the evening. Each thank you and heartfelt embrace reminded her of how far she'd come from that bitter, lonely teacher who had once stood at her classroom window, shutting out the world. In these moments of connection, she felt the full circle of her transformation complete itself. As Ms. Whitman pushed open the heavy auditorium doors, she caught her breath. The morning sunrise painted the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks, fractured by wispy clouds, a mirror image of Andre's gift to her. Streaks of gold threaded through the dawn sky like brushstrokes on nature's canvas. She stood transfixed, her speech notes still clutched in her trembling hand, as the colors deepened and shifted before her eyes. Instead of turning left toward the parking lot, she found herself walking right, toward her studio. The morning air felt electric with possibility, crisp and clean against her skin. Her footsteps quickened as she approached the familiar door, her heart racing with an excitement she hadn't felt in ages. Inside her studio, everything waited exactly as she'd left it. The organized chaos of supplies, the half-empty coffee mug with a faint coffee ring on its side, the blank canvas she'd been avoiding for days. But this morning felt different, charged with creative energy. Without hesitation, she grabbed her paints and brushes, her movements swift and purposeful. The first stroke came easily, a bold sweep of orange across the white surface, then another, and another, each movement more confident than the last. She mixed colors instinctively, deep purples, vibrant yellows, hints of blue, her fingers dancing across the palette. The painting took shape beneath her hands, not quite abstract, but not quite realistic either. It spoke of transformation, of breaking apart and coming back together stronger, like a phoenix rising from ashes. Time melted away as she worked, lost in the rhythm of creation. Her phone buzzed occasionally in her bag, but she ignored it, too absorbed in her work to care. This moment belonged to her and the canvas alone. Each brush stroke felt like breathing, natural and necessary, as if she'd been holding her breath for years and finally remembered how to exhale. For the first time in years, she wasn't painting to prove anything to anyone. She painted because her heart demanded it, because the colors inside her refused to stay contained any longer. Hours passed unnoticed, like leaves carried away on a stream. The morning light grew stronger, streaming through the studio windows and catching the wet paint on her canvas. Tiny droplets of color sparkled on her hands and arms like jewels. She barely noticed the paint on her nice clothes from the assembly, small badges of honor in her renewed passion. Finally, Ms. Whitman stepped back from her work, her brush still warm in her paint-stained fingers. The early morning sun streamed through the windows, illuminating her canvas with a golden glow. She stood quietly, taking in what she had created, feeling the familiar ache in her shoulders from hours of work. For the first time in years, she felt whole, as if a missing piece of herself had finally clicked back into place. If you enjoyed the story of Laura, I handpicked this next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.